Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I wanted to welcome all of you for coming for another Usuli Institute event. And it's really exciting to see that people continue to know more about what we're doing over time. So we launched at the end of last year, and we've been having a lot of excitement and interest around what we're doing. And so if you're new to our work, what we really are interested in doing is trying to elevate and rekindle the love for knowledge in Islamic history and the respect for knowledge and the role that it plays. We try to do something really different, which is bring people together, smart people, to have smart conversations where we can ask difficult questions in a smart environment and really be honest and transparent about our current situation as Muslims and offer something different. And you can definitely get more information about what we do and who we are and what our values are at our website, usuli.org. But we have actually something there that I'm very proud of, which we call our Usuli Institute Credo, and it's our statement of values, and it's what we really believe in the work that we do. There are 10 different things. But today, what we are, I think, 2 of the values that are particularly important is making a real difference in the lives of Muslims and not just acting, working at a theoretical level. Because we are definitely about high standards of scholarship, but the work that we do and the questions we ask really have to make a difference, especially in today's world when there's so much going on and so much suffering. And we have to be able to say that we can really ask the right questions and pursue the right avenues of knowledge. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Heather Laird. She is the director of the Center for Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology at the University of Southern California. And she is doing incredibly important work on a front that has been, historically very taboo, not just for the Muslim community, but I think for all religious communities. And so this is really a perfect opportunity for us to talk about some of these really difficult issues and, take a pulse of what's happening in our community. And, as a faith, we really are a value if we can help those that are most in need. And to begin with that, we have to have some very open and honest conversations about what our situation is and what really needs to be addressed. So we're very honored that Dr. Heather is here with us. And so as far as today, we will have a conversation focused on mostly mental health, and then take some Q&A. And we're also on Facebook Live, so if anyone has some questions, definitely feel free to weigh in. In terms, unfortunately, we're going to focus on just this issue, so we won't get to questions that have been coming in on other topics, but I want to encourage people to please continue to send in whatever questions they are, so hopefully we'll be able to address them at a future halaqah. So thank you very much for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. A couple of things before we start. One, please do continue to send in written questions, although, when we get to a certain question and when it becomes the theme of the halaqah or part of the theme, depends on a lot of things, but they're extremely helpful in knowing what the issues are. So, when you do think of issues that you think should be addressed, do write them. And we've been getting some very good questions that, inshallah, we'll deal with in the future. The second thing is I still have a dream, and the dream is we get to that spiritual spark, that moral spark, where we redirect our resources and wealth where it should be, and that people who Allah has entrusted with the resources of the community will reach out and support our enterprises through the institution of Awqaf or endowments. And I've been talking about the same thing for the past 30 years with very little effect, unfortunately, because right now, it's quite remarkable to me because in the world of classical music, I was just reading an article yesterday about an anonymous benefactor who bought a violin for $16 million and then lent its use to a very famous violinist, and Akiko Mayers, to use throughout her life, throughout her career. And this is very common, by the way, in the world of art and in the world of classical music. This type of generosity is what allows the culture of beauty to persist. And when I read things like that, it strikes at the heart, because we don't have that type of spirit in our Muslim community. And in our Muslim community, if someone spends any money, they expect all type of performances of egoism to accompany it. They want to be acknowledged and celebrated and in fact beholden to, and they want a seat on the board, and they want to affect the agenda, and I still dream of that Muslim, the equivalent of that Muslim benefactor and the anonymous giver of the Diljusu violin, who would say, I believe in the idea, I'm going to support it, and I'm going to fund it. Maybe a miracle will happen. I'm hoping it will happen before I leave this world. That would be nice, but even if it happens after I leave this world, the principle remains the same. Our civilization was built on endowments. It was built on benefactors. And that is why the Quran reminds us that the moral well-being of a nation is always reflected in its wealthiest class. The wealthiest class, you can measure its level of hedonism or its level of purpose with how wealth is handled and dealt with in a community. Our civilization crumbled when our awqaf crumbled, and when corruption and fasad became the prevailing norm in our religious endowments. And in my view, American Muslims are not going to go anywhere, and Muslims in the West, until they realize that they are entrusted in a wealth that Allah will hold them accountable for, in the same way that a person with knowledge, with ilm, is held accountable for what they did with their knowledge, for every bit of knowledge that Allah has gifted to an individual in the hereafter. A person with wealth is going to be held accountable for every single cent and what they did with it. And a person with neither knowledge nor wealth is going to be held accountable for what they did with every minute of their day. Did they spend it depressed, sad, in some couch somewhere watching soap operas? Did they spend it playing video games until their life expired? Or did they expend their time and their life in the service of others and in celebrating the divine creation? The summary of our faith and the summary of our religion is this. You could sum it up in 2 seconds, but it's extremely profound message. What you do with your knowledge, what you do with your time, and what you do with your wealth. Now, moving closer as Grace said, we're honored that Dr. Khaled Laird is with us today. And if you remember from our conversation in the last halaqah, we had Salam al-Mariyati talking about impact, and Khaled Abou, who's a well-known academic with a recent publication, a recent book on Islamophobia. And the issue that we discussed, and again, I do not believe that it is healthy to have a conversation either to condemn or to support as if we're taking parts in some tribal ritual. The purpose is understanding, and the purpose is to ignite thoughts and spirits so that it motivates our actions. And the purpose of the conversation we had with Salam and Khaled Abou is to explore issues that are at the very heart of our fate as American Muslims and as Muslims in the West, and in fact as Muslims in general. And if I would just I do encourage you to watch that conversation on the net if you haven't already heard it. But if I would sum up the problems, it would be the challenge that we confront. On the one hand, we cannot deny that as a people, there is a serious problem with certain theologies that put a little value on those who have systems of belief that are different than these theologies. I mean, whether we call these theologies extremist, fanatic, puritanical, whatever the expression. Theologies that are often patriarchal, that are often oligarchical, that are often despotic in nature, theologies that are intolerant with the others. We can't deny that that has become a part of the Muslim reality. And so what are our obligations towards the existence of these theologies? And how do we engage them, and how do we encounter them, and how do we do so in a way that doesn't exasperate the problem and make it worse? But on the other hand, at the same time, we know that we live in a racially charged environment, in an environment in which there's pervasive religious bigotry, and an environment in which religion has been collapsed with racial identity, and an environment in which Muslims overall are objectified and dehumanized as a people and looked at as if their entire utility is contingent, as if their entire worth is contingent on whether they are a good Muslim or a bad Muslim. And this binary, of course, is extremely dangerous, because what you discover very quickly is that once you try to prove that you're a good Muslim to those who are bigoted and racist, they keep defining you in increasingly deprecatory and demeaning ways. So initially, if I may just become very concrete, right after 9/11, a good Muslim could have been a Muslim that would condemn Al-Qaeda, and a Muslim that would say those who were behind 9/11 are evil people. But very quickly, the playing field shifted, and a good Muslim became a self-hating Muslim, a Muslim of the ilk of Irshad Manji and Hershey Ali and so on. That in order to be a good Muslim, you needed to condemn yourself and to, as if flagellate yourself, beat yourself, and and perform a demeaning dance of self-deprecation in order for those who are in power to say, good boy, you're a good Muslim, we're happy with you. But on the one hand, we are taught by our faith that, as the Prophet ﷺ said, support your brother or your sister, whether they are just or unjust. And as the hadith says, the Prophet is asked, well, we understand how to support them if they're just, but how do we support them if they're unjust? And the Prophet ﷺ said, you support them by preventing them from committing injustice. So, on the one hand, we morally, as Muslims, owe an obligations to God to intervene and prevent evil that adorns itself and that wears the garb of Islam. But on the other hand, we also have an obligation not to empower and to fuel racism and bigotry by playing into the hands of those who, in fact, construct us, or want to construct, in fact, society in binary visions or polarized visions or nativist visions between, the real American and the pseudo-American or the ultra-American or the sub-American. And how do we negotiate this dilemma? And part of the issue that we tried to explore was Khaled Abou, to some, I hope, some degree of success with Khaled and Salam. Part of the issue is, what do we do about governmental-led initiatives in the absence of resources from Muslims themselves, in the absence of these endowments that I'm talking about, in the absence of Muslims spending their money to take care of their own problems? What do we do when the money is offered by the state? Do we touch this money, or do we try to negotiate this money for something that benefits the community, or is this an entirely toxic enterprise? Now, those of you who've heard me before, this problematic, this moral dilemma goes way back in Islamic history. I mean, it goes from the time from the time of the rise of the Umayyad Empire, and Muslim theologians struggling with the issue of, do you work with power or do you oppose power? Do you stand outside power and say, I am a conscientious objector to power and suffer the consequences, whatever there might be? Or is it a moral and Islamic obligation to negotiate with power as much to achieve the maximum amount of good possible? And that in simply an oversimplification of a lot of issues, but in an essence, that is what we were talking about. Now, there was a very important part that came out of this conversation, and a part that my own mother was a psychologist for her whole career, and a problem of that we as Muslims, because of our discourse about religion, we often talk about faith and iman and taqwa as if it is a heal-all. So if you have iman, we like to believe that iman will solve everything. That iman will solve depression, iman will solve paranoias, it will solve all type of mental and psychological defects in our community. Iman will solve sexual addiction, iman will solve all type of things that Heather can be much more qualified in describing than I will. But that we would like to believe that Iman is a sort of a medicine for all ills, that Iman will address alcoholism, drug addiction, human trafficking. But a moment of honesty with ourselves, and we know that this is absolutely not true. Simply declaring the cause of Iman doesn't somehow make all our problems evaporate. And in fact, we have become, as Muslims in the West, very good at ignoring psychological realities and psychological illnesses and challenges that plague our community. I mean, everything from depression to anxiety about bigotry and racism to issues of sexuality to suicides to addiction to the whole range of issues. And we've become also very good at insulating our mosques from real social problems. So if we exist in a community where there's a lot of homelessness and poverty and mental illness, we often have some side office in an Islamic center that no one pays attention to or no one notices. And if someone comes to the mosque and say, I need help, we'll say, well, go talk to such and such official who will give you a check for, a little amount of money, whatever it is, $100, if even that. And khalas, and we go on with our khutbahs and our lectures and as if we've solved the problem. Meanwhile, any of us who've raised children in the West know that we are far from immune. That all the illnesses of society that we live in exist among Muslim families. And this is why I think a conversation with Dr. Laird would be extremely useful, because she's been a pioneer in the area of mental health. And as a theologian and a jurist, mental health does pose some serious questions. I mean, I've been asking these same questions of my mother, by the way, since I was a child. And I'll start with some of the tough ones. I mean, if
No pressure.
it is true that I was raised that if you have true Iman and you have trust in Allah, then there is no reason to be sad, there's no reason to be concerned, worried, that there's no reason to even think of a psychologist or psychiatrist for any purpose. That the power of Allah overcomes you and solves everything. And also to think of things like consumption of alcohol or drugs or suicide from a punitive perspective. So if someone is consuming alcohol, the way I was raised is that to tell them, your crime is so bad that there's a criminal penalty for consuming of alcohol, 60 lashes. You're not going to be lashed 60 lashes because there's no government to implement the penalty. Go repent and ask God for forgiveness for the most serious crime, and sort of the expectation that it heals. But we discovered very quickly that this idealistic vision is not what comports to the reality of our families as Muslims. And that's where a lot of shame comes from. If I do my prayers and I do my fasting and I'm a believer in Allah and I find myself depressed most of the time, there is a certain amount of shame about that because I feel like I'm betraying Allah. If I am an addict there's a certain amount of shame about that because I'm constantly feeling, well, what's wrong with me? Why can't I get it right? A lot of our imams still look at suicide from the perspective of a fallen human being and refusal to even do janazah prayer on these individuals. So first, how do you reconcile the narratives of the seerah of the companions of the Prophet who go from people who've lived in utter corruption to being empowered by Iman and transforming into superhuman beings? How do you go from these narratives of the seerah to the reality that we live? Are we just weaker human beings, and we are psychologically constructed in defective ways, or do we need to retell the story of the seerah because we've superhumanized the companions in ways that are inconsistent with the reality?
So, I think this is a great question, and I appreciate you inviting me to be part of this, because if we, in some small measure, even break this tendency that we have in our community to be very black and white in our thinking, then I think we've had some measure of success. And to begin to answer your question, I would say yes and yes. Like, I think that we can have a plurality of truths exist all at the same time, right? So I don't think that it's necessarily a negative belief to believe that Iman will solve issues, right? But I do think it is all contextual, as you were mentioning. So for example, if you grow up in a shame-based society, that has a utility to it because of the style of government that reigns, then to shame people into positions works in that society to keep people safe, right? By the same measure, when you live in a different society where you have a different type of government, you have the possibility to imagine a different existence which doesn't necessarily require shame-basing. And it allows you to embrace a different way of going about understanding the world. And so I would liken that to where we live, right? And so do we have the freedom to invest in the idea that Iman could cure all here? Of course we do. Is that a reality? Not really. Not on the ground, right? We are encountering from even from a small age, right? What we tell children, toddlers, for example, to deny their fitrah, right? We tell them, you see that stranger, and they're like, oh no, like let me not go to that stranger, stranger danger, right? That's what their fitrah tells them. But we tell them, no, be okay with that person, they're your auntie, they're your uncle, they're okay, right? We start from a very small age to deny them their own fitrah, the inclinations of their own fitrah.
Okay, yeah.
And so that's why we see something else develop. We don't actually have a method of embracing that which would develop Iman as the cure-all.
Give me a sense of how certain things that I remember when the first time I wrote an article about, for instance, sexual abuse. There was a woman who was sexually abused in her family, and I remember the reaction to publishing this article was sort of shock and quite a bit of dismay. Why are you talking about something like this? So to what extent in our Muslim communities in the United States are we plagued by psychological issues like sexual abuse, depression, suicide, addiction, To what extent is it actually pervasive? Is it an issue in our Muslim communities?
So to give you an exact estimation will be difficult because not enough research has been done in this area in our community. However, what we do know, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding came out with a survey that they had conducted in the last few years around sex on college campuses. Young people are having more sex than we know about, right? Typically. Sexual abuse, incest, rape, many of these forms of sexual misbehavior are happening. I can tell you, I know they're happening, okay? How pervasive, I don't know exactly, but I do know that people don't feel comfortable sharing that this is happening. Even when I was doing my dissertation work, I interviewed about 30 families in Michigan out of a particular community. And through that process, I discovered that, there are people who have been, had experienced things like children and never had an outlet to tell anyone. They've grown up, they've been married, they've had children of their own, and I may have been the first person that they've ever been able to talk to, because it's not safe. It's not safe to share because for a woman, they're shamed that they're not marriageable, right? For a man, they're shamed that you're somehow effeminate. There's something wrong with you. Or seen as a bad Muslim, right? What did you do wrong to put yourself in that situation?
The experience you've had where through the Islamic Center you've created a council. I mean, I read, of course, the report you wrote, and I have a lot of questions about it, but can you talk about that initiative in particular? Because it's quite, mental health and Islamic centers so far in America don't seem to go together at all. I've never had the experience of talking to an imam who referred people with very serious problems to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. In fact, there's a tendency in our community to look at it as if we are as if it's a lofty man, a weak faith, that we need a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And if people go, they go secretly and no one talks about it. I've had a repeated experience with youth groups in the United States where you say, we want to show documentaries about sexual abuse, and the answer is always in the negative, that, well, we don't want to expose our youth to material like that. Can you talk about that, especially your experience with Islamic Center?
Sure. So
what was it, and where is it going to go?
So it's actually, let me back up a little bit, because it was actually a blessing that Adina approached me. She approached myself and Sheikh Subhan Mullah at the same time to flesh out this project at the Islamic Center. And it was a blessing because my center was one of the pieces of the platform of the Center for Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology is to work with the masajid in empowering them with mental health resources, whether it's in-house or just locating the resources around a particular masjid, depending on what the preference is of that culture of a given masjid, right? So to have this opportunity to begin what was also in line with our center was fantastic, right? And what we decided to do was, at the Islamic Center of Southern California, was to offer, we basically followed a behavioral health model. If you go on the government websites of what they call behavioral health, it's the same model. It's promotion, prevention, direct services, and then recovery. Promotion and prevention are all about education and educating people about different topics, different issues around mental health, how they can access them, access help for them. and just familiarizing people with what is a mental health problem and what isn't, right? Distinguishing between when does something become a disorder, right? And then direct services, obviously, are treatment, and then recovery is when you're post-treatment, right? And you're trying to maintain your health. So it's getting to a place of mental health and recovery. We are not at that place, right? That's some place bar, perhaps, for our community at this point. But at least we were able to work on promotion, prevention, and intervention. When we first started last year, the program itself started in January, but we didn't actually start offering services until late April. In January or February, I'm not sure which one, we did a educational session called Let's Be Honest, which was a forum to answer questions. We covered things like racism and sexual issues. I mean, it was a variety of things. We basically let the audience determine what the issues were on their minds that they wanted to talk about. We did a session with adults, we did a session with the youth, very different sessions, but very interesting what they're talking about, right? So with the parents, they're wanting to know how to manage certain things. With the children, you know, they're having conversations around pornography and different things that have caught their eye, right? We moved on there, though, to offer direct services. We didn't even advertise, and it had a full caseload.
And what's a full caseload?
Well, a full caseload, well, given my time, I had a limited amount of time that I was there. A full caseload generally is about 20 patients a week. But people see up to 40. You can't see more than 40. But we know after you see 35 people, your ability to actually give them the best service is diminished. And so those last 4 patients or 5 patients that you see after may not get much if you see 40 clients, right? Ideally, 20 is the optimal. If you go past 35, you're, not offering the best of services, 35, 36. That's according to the research that's been done.
You found the Muslim community, at least the ones that are the patrons of the Islamic Center of Southern California, in need of the services you provided?
Absolutely, and to be fair and honest, not all the people that came were from ICSC, right? People were traveling from the Inland Empire to get services.
And what's the range of mental health issues that you dealt with?
Well, everything. Everything you can imagine that fits into the dominant culture shows itself in ours, plus a couple more with religious oppression. That's a little extra piece that you don't see in the dominant culture because it's not important to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in those kind of cases, using onesie man is not it's not something you can do right at the beginning, if at all, right? But everything from sexual abuse to marital concerns to depression, substance use and abuse. What else? I don't know. There's so many issues, honestly.
Just so everyone, so the funding, where the patients, they were not paying for the services themselves, right?
Right, that's one of the ways that we were actually able to have people come and be able to talk about these things is because most of the people that I saw could not have afforded services had there not been funding for it. But the funding came from the mayor's office. Mayor Eric Garcetti had funding in a grant from FEMA called Building Healthy Communities. And FEMA, as you know, falls under the Department of Homeland Security.
Right.
And out of that, he funded $20,000 for this project, which went to various costs, but one of those costs was me. Yeah, we were able to affect about 5,000 people with that grant.
I mean, I'm gonna, you know, I'm known for saying things that are very blunt, and now I feel a widening moment coming over me. It is my observation, and I don't know if you agree with me or not, that the Muslim community, it's as if they expect psychologists and lawyers to work for free. If you're a medical doctor, you know, cardiologist or something, they expect you to get paid. But, so, one of the most frequent comments I've heard is, well, why did she have to get paid? Why couldn't she just do the counseling for free? So, why do you have to get paid, Heather?
Gee, I don't know. You know, although I am very, very grateful. You know, yesterday, Sherman and I celebrated our 24th anniversary. And I think I met you like maybe 22 years ago.
Well, it was right after you guys got married.
It's at Mesa, I think.
Yeah, amazing.
And yeah, which means I've been a Muslim for 26 years, because I was Muslim for 2 years before we got married. And, woo. I was still a teenager. But anyway, the point is that I'm grateful that my husband supports me. But you know, it's not my husband's obligation to.
There is a serious. I mean, there's a serious underlying issue here. Is that we don't invest the resources to provide mental health care, and at the same time, when the money became available through FEMA, the main criticism is that, well, this is part of a national security anti-radicalization paradigm. And the most common, well, why did you have to take the money? Two is, now that you've taken the money, isn't the mental health services provided, aren't they compromised by a prevailing national security paradigm? In other words, aren't you collecting information and data on people that ultimately will be available to the government to go after Muslims if they need to?
Right. So no, you know, the thing is that we're bound by the same American laws that everyone else is, right? And which, you know, consists for a therapist, we have HIPAA laws, which mean that we have informed consent when somebody comes into our office.
Can you explain for the benefit of everyone what HIPAA laws are?
So the HIPAA stands for Health Insurance, Privacy Protection Act, I think. But HIPAA was established actually for just medicine in general to ensure that patients' rights were protected, that their privacy was protected, because there had been a tradition of people casually sharing information which wasn't safe for the patient to then reveal different things that were going on with them biologically or emotionally or socially. And so HIPAA was created. It wasn't that well enforced when it first came out. But for therapists, it's the difference between being able to be a therapist and not be a therapist. Because privacy is everything when it comes to doing therapy. Without that trust, without that ability to have privacy, you can't do therapy. Now, when a patient comes into a session, we give them what we call informed consent. Actually, I give it to them ahead of time so they can have plenty of time to read it. because it's not short, but and it's full of legalese, right?
Right.
But it essentially means that we cannot break their confidentiality with the exception of 2 occasions. Those 2 occasions would be harm to self
Right.
and harm to others. And that doesn't even apply in all cases. So if somebody comes in and tells me I murdered somebody 10 years ago, that is not a harm to others. That's already been done, and I cannot breach their confidentiality. If they come in and tell me I'm going to kill somebody today, then yes, their confidentiality gets breached. And what is the premise of that? The good of the community, right? And for themselves, right?
Why did this, I mean, what is that controversy around this specific program that you're involved with? I mean, why all the sparks and debates and so
Well,
on?
so that's a lot to unpack because there are several reasons. It's quite dynamic actually why that happened. One reason is a narrative of my being a white Muslim. Therefore, I must be embedded with the FBI. Although my shahada 26 years ago meant nothing. There is another narrative that suggests that because the funding came from the Department of Homeland Security, that it must be therefore compromisable, and they can come in at any time and get my files and what have you. But honestly, first of all, because of this fear, I also I take very minimal notes, for my own safety, my own protection of my patients, right? Because is it possible that a government can become tyrannical and do things like that? Yes. We've seen it happen around the world, right? We've seen edging toward that in our own country. Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? No. We have way too many protections in place, I think, to make sure that doesn't happen. I also don't keep any electronic records to ensure, again, a level of safety. However, because for some people, again, going back to this black and white thinking, some people have invested so much of themselves politically. There's such a dislocation, that they have almost made this topic of CVE a 6th pillar of Islam, and I don't really understand that until I got involved with this whole project. To be very honest with you, I hadn't really known much about CVE. It wasn't a part of my life. And I would suggest also that's another layer to this, right? So it is more important, let's say, in the discussions of many of our immigrant Muslims or second-generation Muslims, right? It's not an important conversation in the black Muslim community, for example. You don't hear people, I've asked people, do you know what CVE is? And they were like, what are you talking about, right? One brother said to me, I updated mine last week. So it's not, necessarily something that's focused on every aspect of the community, not that meaningful. When I started reading about it, however, because the topic did come up for continuing funding, right?
Right.
The first thing I did is I read the grant itself. The grant itself is about resiliency, which is something that I definitely promote in the community because it's something that our kids are lacking. Speaking of Islamophobia, right? We piloted a project at the New Horizons Pasadena last year to promote resiliency protective factors to combat Islamophobia, right? It was a pretty successful program. We had pretty successful outcomes with it. However, we had no funding for it, right? So I'm reading this grant and I'm thinking, this actually sounds like what we were doing at New Horizons last year, the kind of things we want to promote, resiliency. However, what I discovered was that there are politics tied up with this grant, right? So first, administration changes, because when Obama was president, there seemed to be less of an issue with this, and then Trump becomes president, it becomes more of an issue. And the travel ban somehow gets put in the mix of CVE, like they all get kind of pushed together as if they're all the same issue. But they're not, and also the other thing that through my own taking a look at this issue, my difficulty personally with CVE, and the reason why I turned the money down 3 times, even though it had been offered to me, after Impact turning it down, was because to me it's a systemic issue, right? We have seen historically in the United States, we used to have a lot of mental health hospitals, right? Now the mental health hospitals were problematic. They had systemic issues of their own. People were not getting better. Treatment, people were getting left for long periods of time by themselves, not, or just put on drugs for days. I mean, they weren't all that effective, right? But rather than fixing what was sort of broken, they just got shut down for the most part altogether. What happened to those people is they ended up on the streets, and then those people became our homeless population. A lot of our homeless population have dual diagnoses, so meaning that they have both a mental health disorder and an addiction, primarily because they're coping with being on the street, right? But what happens to them then? They get arrested, they get put in jails. So what we see is this systematic, attempt to, whether consciously or not, to put mental health and mental illness into a criminalized state. So we shut down the hospitals, put them on the street, we put them in jail, we criminalize them. What do we see happen after that? Funding for mental health or mental illness goes under Department of Homeland Security. It never belonged there, right? Law enforcement does not have a place in mental health, except for, the occasion of saving somebody's life if they're trying to kill themselves or kill someone else, right? Except for maybe forensic psychology when you're trying to discern what happened after a crime. Beyond that, law enforcement does not have a place in mental health. And so the reason I turned down the money, even though we very much need it, because as I said, most of the people I saw could not afford therapy otherwise. It's because, from my mind's eye, it criminalizes mental illness, right? The money what we need to be doing is advocating for the money to be put back under Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA, which is a piece of Health and Human Services, which stands for Substance Abuse Mental Health Association. And, and if the money were there, I would be happy to take it, because mental health usually gets paid for by grants from the government.
This really begs another question, and the issue of radicalization, and to what extent, one of the fascinating things about the report you've written, to what extent is radicalization and terrorism a psychological issue rather than a theological issue? And to what extent can we even hope to intervene to prevent the commission of this type of violence? Because it's a violence that's animated by thought, and it's rather than just an impulse violence. To what extent does should psychology play a role in the realm of anti-terrorism?
I think it has a very important role to play, just as spirituality itself has an important role to play. It's not the first go-to, I think, but it's an eventuality. What I mean by that is, if we look at what happens to people when they become radicalized, we see they go down this path of alienation, of beginning to have what we call cognitive closure, which happens when somebody, it can happen from somebody being angry to somebody feeling oppressed, from somebody being abused, you know. But their go-to doesn't have to be radicalization, right? I mean, because if we looked at the example of the Prophet Muhammad, he was oppressed. He was kicked out of his home. He moved somewhere else. He didn't become radicalized, right? So what happens? Well, I think in modernity, what we're looking at a bit is, I mean, it's a very layered and complex problem, but one of the issues is the way that we have framed, going back to, you know, how in some societies shame-basing works, other societies, it's how we're framing things in our community, right? What I've seen over the years that I've been Muslim in America, right, is that we have created a narrative in our community that the only existence worth having, right, is to be an Islamic scholar. And the extent, you know, to which vis-a-vis you are more or less an Islamic scholar determines your value in the community, right? Now, not everybody is going to be you, or my husband, or, you know, the other scholars that we know. I mean, they don't have necessarily the capacity for it, or the inclination for it. And but because we've constructed that, right, we have this sort of vertical existence. And with that existence, we have not allowed for people to develop what their calling is, right? And to see that as a valued existence. So the people who right now clean the masjid, right? If they didn't clean that masjid after everybody comes through and does everything and makes a mess, we wouldn't have a nice place to go to. That's a valuable existence. That's worthy. It's a worthy existence. Do we tell them that? Not generally, right? And part of that has to do with a conflict of going into another layer here, right? A conflict of narratives, right? So many, it is a different reality for our indigenous Muslims versus our immigrant Muslims. For our immigrant Muslims, many of them come from very class stratified societies. So when they see people who are poor, they treat them like their existence is not important, right? That leads them into a psychological space of unworthiness. When indigenous Muslims and immigrant Muslims come into contact with each other, and that framework is the prevailing framework, it also then increases the clash of racism, right? And so that becomes another layer. It's very layered, right? It's very complex. And so, but what all of these different narratives and different issues that are all getting mixed up in this very diverse community.
If we wanted to, if we, all of us as Muslims, the minute there's a terrorist attack, we cringe,
Yeah.
right? And we all pray, God, please let it not be Muslim. And this is, and it's oppressive because other communities don't have to go through this. The minute there is an act of public violence, other communities don't say, God, please not let it be homosexual. God, please don't let it be this. But we Muslims feel all. Because the impact is going to affect all of us regardless. Now, but at the same time, I don't think it's the idea of, well, let's try being proactive by investing in mental health to try to even understand the phenomenon of radicalization among our own communities is very alien and very foreign. I mean, if anything, we might think, well, maybe a good khutbah is what's needed. Or maybe have an imam go around, correcting people's mind. But the idea of dealing with it as a mental health issue, and that's partly I feel like we don't know what to do with mental health in relation to Islamic theology. That's a very big issue.
You know, and it's kind of, for me, it's a little surprising, you know, to hear that, because if we put this back in a context of tribe, we don't have a problem understanding that, right? If somebody in the tribe is ill, then the tribe helps the person who's ill.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so why would it be different here, right? Why is it different that it's just like if a person has a mental illness, it's the same as if they have a heart problem, right? It's the same as if they have high blood pressure or they have diabetes. They have to have it treated.
And again, I assume complete ignorance. To what extent, I mean, we all read about the manufacturing, the social construction of mental illness. For instance, the rate of public addiction to antidepressants, and you have these ongoing debates about whether psychology has overextended itself and basically given an out for people so that people don't take responsibility for their own actions. And so basically people develop a culture in which they constantly diffuse responsibility and constantly blame the other and so on. Can you address that? I mean, especially from the perspective of a Muslim psychologist, at what point do you say to someone who comes to you, say, you know, I'm so depressed, I don't pray anymore, I'm so depressed, I don't know what I believe in anymore, and to what extent do you negotiate, I mean, how do you negotiate this issue between actual mental illnesses in a heart condition and the social construction of responsibility and willpower and autonomy and so on?
So that's a good question, right? Because how do we define something that is a disorder, period? And I mean, sometimes, to be honest with you, even though we have this book of diagnoses, it is a social construction, right? But the way we define whether something actually becomes a disorder or not is dependent upon how it is interfering with one's ability to live their life, right? Is it disrupting their ability to work? Is it disrupting their ability to have relationships with people? And if it is so affecting them to the point where they can't have those things, then it is a disorder, right? But to say that somebody has depression in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. So let's say somebody passes away, right? And you feel a little sad about it, which is another word that we use for depression, right? Sadness. That's not only normal and natural, but expected. And if you actually are not sad about somebody passing away, there's something to be looked at there, right? So depression in and of itself is not a bad thing, and I think that part of our issue as a community is being in touch and understanding emotions, period, right? All the emotions have a utility to them that are both positive and negative. Anger has a positive utility to it. Anger sets boundaries with people.
So when someone comes to, I mean, and again, I'm playing devil's advocate because these are issues we all live through. When someone says, you know, look at the companions, look at the Prophet, he lost his son Ibrahim, he was sad at the moment of burial, and then he went on with his life. We put such what's the word I'm looking for? Standard for Muslims that is, I feel often the expectation that is so high that it's crushing for most people when they don't meet it. And I mean, so what is it that we've idealized the narrative about the companions of the period of the Prophet and his companions, that we need to revisit it? Or is it that we should take these stories as inspirational, but not necessarily as a method of morally evaluating our own conduct? Because, I mean, you see the problem here is that for a theologian coming in and say, well, you know, I'm not willing to negotiate this tradition because that's too dangerous. And I want to cite this tradition as the yardstick by which all of us have to live. And if we don't meet it, then, you know, comes the judgment that your iman is defective. And psychology and iman have a very complex relationship that I don't think we've even started exploring. I mean, what's remarkable is that I read in Christian theology like Kierkegaard, and I find that they have gone a great distance in negotiating that relationship between psychology and faith. But we Muslims have not even begun the journey.
So again, another complex question. I do think that we actually started embarking on this at the conference, right?
Well, that's right,
We, in February, for those who don't know, we had a conference on moving toward defining an Islamic psychology, where we had both Islamic scholars and mental health professionals who treat Muslim clients in conversation with one another. And what we discovered there, right, is also, I think, analogous to what's happening in the community, which is that we have, so have we embellished some of those stories into some kind of rigidity? Perhaps there's some truth to that, because we seem to forget things like, you know, that the Prophet talked to alcoholics, you know, and dealt with them on an individual basis, right? We seem to forget the narrative, very important narrative around repentance and Toba, right? Like the idea of Toba is to escape our community. There's the narrative of the angels has taken the day. But, so that is a piece, right? But another piece is Islamic literacy. I mean, it just doesn't exist. I just, you know, beyond the scholars, I don't see people having a basic literacy of their deen. Which is why you know, the idea that somebody's going to come in for therapy and be able to utilize their deen for their treatment is a very small percentage of people. Because they don't even understand their deen to use it in that way. Now, can we work with that over time? Yes, absolutely. But it's a team effort, right? It's our institutions that teach Islamic literacy to be supported, endowed, so that that can actually happen and multiply. It's also institutions like my own where we are treating people where they are. So we take people where they are, right? And we try to move them to a better place. What that looks like for each individual is going to look different. But by the same token, we're not being funded well at all, right? And so without that, we can't make progress on it.
Is the program with Islamic Center still ongoing, or has it ended?
No, it's still ongoing. I've been seeing people for free.
That's what I was sort of expecting things were going to go, because the money runs out, right? And then becomes, what do you do at this point?
Well, what I've tried to institute, right, is so the Islamic Center, you know, that's not quite 100% fair. The Islamic Center, they liked what happened, right, with what they were seeing in community members, right? Although they don't know who my clients are, but they were noticing something different happening. Plus we had some psychoeducational sessions where they did see community members taking part. And so a few things came out of that pilot, right? One was that the center itself saw a need to devote a certain amount of money every year in its budget to mental health. It's a small amount, but it's a start. I don't know what they'll actually do with that money, but they have allocated some money for mental health. I also gave them a sliding scale fee, which is helpful in that kind of setting, that community setting, community mental health setting, whereby depending upon a person's income, it goes by the poverty guidelines that we have in the United States, period, right? So it's based on your income, your size of your family, and all of that. And so the person finds themselves on that, and that's what they pay, right? That has been helpful. Some people can adjust to that sliding scale and still come, right? And some people have, in all honesty, been paying in a sliding scale fee. But most people cannot afford it. So some people have just not come at all. Other people I have chosen to take on pro bono because because I'm a part of this community and I can't say no. Although I will have to say no, you know, eventually. I can't do that forever.
When I hear you talk about these services, I mean, still, I go back and I recall all the heated controversy and what a lot of people took very, say, draconian positions about. And it seems like, yeah, considering how many serious issues plague our community, this should not be, this should have not been a subject of much controversy. I mean, it's...
Honestly, it shouldn't. I mean, one of the things that, so what I, you know, to switch a little bit, when I did my research for my dissertation, I decided to look at how can we destigmatize mental illness and psychotherapy in the Muslim community. So my project consisted of educating a community on family systems theory because I aligned it with Islamic values. We're a very family-centered community, and by demonstrating that psychology itself is way beyond Freud, right? Because people generally have a visceral reaction to Freud in our community, but we're way beyond that. Family systems theory is exactly what it sounds like. It's a systems theory. It looks at the family generationally. What can we learn from families that's dysfunctional, right? And predict what would happen if they continue down this road, so we can tweak things in the future, or correct things in the past. So for example, if you have generations of domestic violence, it's likely you'll continue that pattern. We can break the pattern, right? So to place and empower our community with the knowledge that there are theories out here and ways of treatment that are consistent with your beliefs as a Muslim, right, was quite empowering. So in one of the pieces of treatment with family systems theory is what we call a genogram, which traces those social relationships and behavioral relationships through the generations, and we can successfully do it up to 10 generations, right, when we have the information. So by doing that, we had a positive attitude shift towards psychotherapy and mental illness in that one community that I worked with. And then I also did the genograms of 30 families in that community to mine for what are the mental health issues that exist, right? And what I found was that we have such great diversity in our community. Along ethnic lines, there are different issues that exist, right? Primary issues when it comes to mental health and mental illness. And at the root of many of them, because our community is an amalgamation of minority communities, right? With a 1% to 2% small exception, right? All of those minority communities historically have had some kind of trauma, right? And so whether it's South Asians and the partition, or people in the Middle East, there's many, right? African American slavery, right? So racism. I mean, so there's trauma in every one of our communities, right? In some way or another. That has affected our generations of people. Now, we don't stop there, obviously, because, like I said, the Prophet himself was oppressed. So it's not enough just to explain what it is, right? But how do we treat it? this has become front and center for me. Even most recently, we've had, the shooting of Stephon Clark. Then shortly after that, we had the Muslim brother in New York that was shot. Then the next, couple of days, we have this brother Talib in the Carolinas who was shot. That is an example right there of what I'm talking about. You have one trauma after the other, and this systemic racism is a traumatizing force in and of itself, right? And people never actually get to grieve. They don't get to grieve. They don't get to express what's happening before another one happens, right?
Right.
And we just end up with people stuffing down, trying to repress just to live a daily life, right? And this is not healthy. It is not healthy for our community. Where does that go? What happens to it? It comes out somewhere.
When Islamic centers, even our Americans and Islamic centers, we live these traumas, but we continue having our events being on a dogmatic narrative. I mean, we continue doing Quranic tafsir and stories of the seerah and not talk about the realities of the life we live. I mean, it's as if we have become very good at constructing an extremely artificial environment in which we dwell for just once a week during Sundays, maybe during Jumu'ah, and I'm not even sure how to describe this artificial environment. I mean, what function does it play?
Well, I think that it plays the function of allaying fear. People are afraid. At the base of their inaction or that sort of, I don't want to say delusional, but fairy tale narrative about Islam and our history and our, narratives, at the root of that is fear. Like if we have to actually look at what's behind the curtain, it's scary, right? I first came upon this, I think, for myself when we were living in Michigan. I was teaching an Islamic studies class at the time for children, and we were going through the Quran and looking at each prophet and their stories, right? We got to Prophet Lut, right? The parents were in an uproar. They didn't want us talking about Prophet Lut. And I'm like, well, that's a reality. It's in Quran for a reason, for us to learn something, right? The fear behind that, why are we so afraid of that? Why are we afraid of that story, It's not contagious.
Right.
So, why are we afraid of it? It's a part of our daily reality. And especially living here in California, it's very much a part of our reality, right? So, why are we afraid of it? If we hide it, we repress it, we push it down, it never gets dealt with. We have to bring these things out, talk about them, and then we can decide as a community, how do we healthily deal with issues?
At this point, actually, I think if people want to ask questions, jump in.
Actually, how did you teach the kids? I mean, how about Sayyid Maloud, how you explain to them? Because you have to make moral judgment, I suppose. Or you have to teach them tolerance, or how would you reconcile?
I actually don't believe in teaching it that way, right?
How you teach it?
So we talked about the story in that whole series of teachings that we did about the different prophets, right? Was to get the kids to develop critical thinking skills, right? So what happens if you encounter somebody who identifies as LGBTQ or any number of other identifications, right? What is your reaction to that person, right? We don't have, in America, for sure, we don't have any court system to actually carry out any, to carry out any punishments, right? But how does that affect the average person on the street or the kid who's encountering somebody who comes to them and says, I'm having these funny feelings, or I'm not sure about who I am. Why can't it be that we help them figure that out, right? Why does it have to be a moral judgment? What is this huge thing in our community about judgment all the time? Judgment is for Islamic lawyers and judges and those people who are going to pronounce that. But as me, as your brother or sister in Islam, why do I have to constantly judge you? I'm not saying I shouldn't be able to discern. I need to be able to discern what's right and wrong, right? But does that mean that I have to classify you as something other than a human being who has challenges, who's trying to, work through those challenges? I mean, as Khaled, mentioned at the very beginning, and it's something I like to go back to a lot. If our brother or sister are doing wrong, we help them until they do right. We don't condemn them to hell right away. I mean, I would hate to be judged, on what I was doing, in my 20s, or just the ideas I had in my 20s. I was already married by then, but the ideas, the thoughts I had, the thought processes I had in my 20s, now, right? I would hate to be judged on that, but because I'm just a human being, So why do we have to bottle and box people into positions and say, you're this, you're now labeled as this, and you're a throwaway, person, instead of just saying, or reframing and saying, okay, this person is struggling, how can I help them? And maybe it's not you that helps them, right? Maybe it's that you help them get help, right? It's not, incumbent upon you to have all the answers, but that you help them get help. I think if we instituted in our communities the concept of brothering, that the Prophet had, right? I think we would have less need for mental health. If people actually had to know each other better, and know what the person needed before they asked for it, we would have less need for therapists.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. We don't have any system of mentorship or brothering. I want to. There's so many.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Just to finish answering your question, I may have a little bit more liberal viewpoint on this. Okay, and so for those of you who are uncomfortable, I don't know if I'm sorry for your uncomfortability, but I just recognize and acknowledge that you are.
You'd be very surprised how we think.
That with this issue, right? So if somebody comes to me and they say I'm attracted to, they're a woman and they say I'm attracted to a woman, right? That doesn't scare me, right? So my question is not, do you have this attraction? My question is, what do you plan to do with it, right? Now, as a Muslim, if they tell me, well, the women part actually is problematic. Let's go to the men, because it's a little bit more. The women part is a little bit more complicated. But let's say a man, okay?
Why?
Well, because I have my own questions about the Islamic laws around that, and I have to consult. I'm not really sure. Because Islamic law, I understand, is about penetration. Yes, not okay. So yeah, that's a bit more confusing for me. But with a man, if he says, I have this attraction to another man, okay, what are you planning to do with that? Maybe he's not planning to do anything. Maybe he's just saying, okay, I recognize and acknowledge I have this attraction, but I'm not going to act upon it. Okay. I mean, we have to look at, whenever we treat somebody, we look at different areas, right? We look at the biological that's affecting them. We look at the social, the psychological, the spiritual factors, all of those things, right? In our society right now, with the way the media is and all the advertising we've had for generations now, I'd be shocked if a woman honestly told me they weren't attracted to another woman, right? Or didn't find other women attractive. Because all the advertisement has suggested that we should find women attractive, we should find them sexy and naked most of the time, right? So for us to deny that this is not also being taught to us and we're, systematically, I think we're being dishonest. And in our community, we're so far behind in these conversations. But I think that underneath the surface, people want to have them. they just don't know how to go about them and have a safe space to do so, right?
Before we take, I have a lot of tough questions, so, to just take whatever, answer whatever you want out of these questions. Again, from a juristic point of view and the point of view of a theologian, one of my friends, Summer Hathout, is a prosecutor, and she prosecutes people who consume child pornography. And there was a fellow among the people who prosecuted and sentenced was a Muslim guy. And a young Muslim fellow who responded to an ad, so on and so forth. And I was having another one of these debates with an imam, mullah, whatever you want to call him. Well, the argument goes, it's a completely westernized, it's caving into the Western civilization to accept the idea of attraction to children as a form of pedophilia. The argument goes that pedophilia is a completely Western invention construct. Now, I know from a lawyer's point of view is that the common law system, the old common law system, the age for marriage used to be 10, then it was raised to 12, then it was raised to 16, 17, then now 18. So I know that the law has struggled with this idea, but the issue is when you see what happens in a lot of Muslim countries where people marry children, and the argument is, well, it cannot be wrong because it was practiced by our predecessors, etc., etc. How does psychology and how do we negotiate theology and psychology on a point like this?
Again, I'm going to go back to context, right? Because I'm sure you get that question a lot about, Aisha and that whole issue, right?
Yeah.
But if we go back to context and we look at the environment at the time, if that were so unusual to have married somebody that young at that time, the whole community would have been in an uproar. They weren't, because that was normal and people were different. The maturity of people then, I suspect, was a lot different than it is now. What we know right now, biologically speaking, we say the brain doesn't develop fully until the age of 25. So our kids are not kids, technically speaking, until after 25. Their brain is not fully developed. The last part of the brain to develop is the executive function in the prefrontal cortex, right? Which is where they deal with impulsivity, where they deal with making reasonable decisions. So until 25, they kind of have a pass. Sort of, because their brain has not really fully developed that part. Now, that has evolutionarily changed. It has not always been the case. But we seem to be getting older and older with this full development of the brain. Before, it was a younger age when the brain was full, what we believe the brain was fully developing. Why is that changing? Why is it becoming a later age? I can't account for that. Maybe a neuropsych person could. But the car companies even know, not to rent a car until you're 25 because they know that you're too impulsive, right? As a community, though, we have not acknowledged this piece, and maybe people don't know. In all fairness, I want to be fair to people, maybe they don't know that. But we send our kids off to school at 18 to live in dormitories that they're not prepared for because they're still impulsive. And we don't critically look at these things to say, this system might not be working right? But at the same time, to look at pedophilia, for example, today in modernity is not what was before. The people are not the same. People weren't even living that long, back then.
But, I mean, it does require a reconstruction and rearticulation of theology and law, because if we continue to repeat what we find in books, of fiqh, and, you know, read the Mukhtasar Khalil in Maliki law and translate it to English and then teach it in our schools or whatever seminaries, and celebrate it as God's law without these other serious epistemological questions, then we're really betraying our faith and our tradition.
Right.
Because I mean, we translate these books, our manuals on fiqh, verbatim, and we translate hadith of the Prophet on the Riyadh al-Salihin, the Gardens of the Righteous, and teach them as if they're the doctrinal truth, without any of these interventions about evolution, about psychology, about consciousness. And I think it's leading us to disastrous areas. I mean, we end up with a lot of paradoxes that we cannot deal with.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's almost like constitutionalism, right? Are you a literalist, or do you see this as a breathing document, right? And I think that there are many ways in which our Islam itself is a breathing entity, right? I mean, we have to. I very much, believe in tradition, but I think that tradition doesn't mean that you're also rigid and static.
Right.
You can actually revisit these and look for the context, look for the history, what is happening, what's different, how do we need to adjust. I mean, when we've talked about, for example, like addiction, right? If we know biologically that there are certain receptors in the brain that, if they get turned on a certain way, then they start taking control of the person, right? Is that person now of their own volition committing this harm? Or is it, something that's become a biological, part of who they are, right? Because, for example, we talk about the opioid crisis right now across the nation because it's huge. Opioids, when they are abused, or even if they're not abused, but they're just overly prescribed, right? It shuts down certain receptors in the brain to where they stop producing things like dopamine, which is one of our happy neurotransmitters, right? So it gets shut down, people become depressed. What happened there, Is it that person's fault? They trusted a doctor who told them to take this, they took it, and now they literally, their brain is changed. Islamic law needs to accommodate those realities.
Yeah, I mean, this is what it seems like doing Islamic law or Islamic theology without a conversation with mental health specialists is a disaster. I mean, how can you talk about law and theology for a human being if you don't understand the human being? And I don't see a lot of people who care about Islamic law or theology in conversation with mental health people, or even care about psychology. And this is a real crisis.
It is a crisis, and we see this affecting not just individuals. So when we speak of psychology, right, in my particular paradigm, we talk about systems. It's not just the individual, it's couples, it's families, it's the community. You can have a whole community that's depressed, right? We even see this in places like Iran, right? It's advantageous to be depressed in Iran. If you're one of those flowers, like a daisy that pops up above, you can get your head chopped off, right? I mean, that's, it actually behooves you to be a little bit depressed, so that you are safe,
Why is that?
Why?
Yeah.
Because the government, you know, I don't want to speak of current governments, but let's the government historically, if you stand out, if you go against them, if you have a different idea than them, you could be in trouble, right?
Not in any government, but why if you are depressed you're safer or
Because then you're not apt to, you know, go out and do something out of the box, right? You're more apt to stay in line with whatever the message of the day is.
I mean, if I can, growing up, this is something growing up in the Arab countries that I grew up in, you definitely learn intuitively to negotiate safety in a certain way. In the context of a country like Egypt and Kuwait, it was okay to stand out in frivolous ways. So you're a partier, for instance. You can stand out as a party person, but you can't stand out as an intellectual. Then yes, you could get your head cut off.
Right.
And you learn this intuitively, and you learn to negotiate, but it leaves deep psychological scars inside of you. And you bring these scars to the country you immigrate to, and this is...
And they pass on generationally.
And that's
And
what
not
the-
even consciously. It's like no
Yeah.
parent would choose to hurt their children. I mean, well, I take that back. There are some people who suffer from mental ailments that actually do hurt their children, right? But if they were consciously thinking about, I want to hurt my child, that would be the rarity, if ever, right? People do not set out to hurt their children.
Doesn't this explain a lot about the huge gap between, for instance, the African American community and the immigrant community, African American Muslim community and the immigrant community? Because I mean, I'm one of the very bruising experience. The son of a very well-known Muslim leader in the U.S. I'm not going to name him because everyone would have heard that one. His son, I got involved in a case where he married secretly a girl. That leader and his family were completely opposed to the marriage because she's black. And then when they learned that he had married her secretly, they intervened. They undid the marriage, and then I got involved because of a lawsuit where we're forcing him to take responsibility for the paternity of the child. But the entire dynamic, because we tried to get the family to accept the marriage, and it was complete rejection because she's black. And after the many experiences after that, with how deeply embedded certain racist attitudes in the immigrant community are. I mean, we're not comfortable with blacks. We don't work with blacks. We don't marry blacks.
The spirituality was completely missing there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I didn't hear the question about was she a practicing Muslim or not.
Oh, she was extremely devout.
Right. So by our standards, spiritually,
No, hold on.
she is a good.
Because this is a very serious point. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, by our standards, spiritually, she's a good mate.
Absolutely. I mean, from an Islamic perspective, but these are serious elements in our community. I mean, I go through Islamic centers all over the U.S. and I see how many blacks are on the board of directors. Non-existent.
But why do you blame Islam? Why not their culture?
Not Islam.
It's their culture, that's the way it is.
Islam is not the problem.
Yeah, but it's
It's
their
our
culture.
cultures
Yeah,
that are
that is
problem.
right. It's their culture that don't accept that.
But we need to address it psychologically, and that's the point we're making, is that we need to address the psychological defect that creates that culture.
It was, that was kind of circling back to this whole funding issue, right?
Right.
That was one of the interesting wrinkles to me, and that if you're going to, presume that I'm somehow an FBI agent because I'm white and a Muslim, right? You also need to presume that because I'm an indigenous Muslim, I might have a different perspective on the government than an immigrant Muslim. I grew up as this is my homeland. I have a different understanding of how things work here. Why shouldn't I be able, as an ally in my own community, to be able to work at that better than maybe someone else? The same is true of Black Muslims, you know? And I think that as a community, we've done ourselves a real disservice in alienating one from the other, you know, the immigrant to the Black Muslim, because Black Muslims have insight in this country that is so valuable that if the immigrant were to embrace the Black Muslim, the benefits, the value could be immeasurable.
Absolutely.
So is
So,
it-
hold on one second. So I asked people to write their questions on cards. If you are more comfortable giving me that, I can read them. Or also, if you are fine with having your questions, just state them out. I'm going to take a couple, 2 or 3 people just to say their question, just in the interest of time, and then we'll let Heather choose to address it. So let's start here. Anthony, go ahead if you want to.
Thank you guys. I just wanted to know what you thought about the extent to which liberalism, ideological liberalism, plays a role in mental health, and specifically, does it exacerbate the feelings of like alienation that certain people might feel in the community, or about the idea of community as a whole?
Okay, and then Una, go ahead. I'm going to have 3 people state their questions.
I want to know, when you're talking about community, our community, our community, what does community mean? Community and brotherhood. I think those are super 2 words that are extremely important and at the heart of so many things. Because when we talk about judging or not judging and the human being, this applies to every single culture and every single human being on earth. It doesn't apply to the Islamic community in so many ways. You know, nobody has the right to judge another one, not even a sister or a brother, you know, when we think of it. So when we say the community is going to judge you, there's a huge problem there also.
Okay, one more question, and then I'll let Heather respond. Amanda?
I don't know if this was his question too, but I boil things down to personal responsibility. So my question is, how can we assimilate the 2 sides of therapy, which are safety through privacy and transparency and open conversation of mental issues and disorders on a personal level?
Say that again for me.
So how can we, on a personal level, feel safety through privacy and transparency and open conversation of the mental issues or the struggles we're having? How can we assimilate those 2 on a personal level?
Okay. That's not all the questions.
No, there's more, so we'll do 3 at a time. So.
Okay. Let me work backwards. So, I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly, but if you can correct me if I didn't. So on an individual level, we have these safeguards, these legal safeguards, right? But whether it's on an individual level or a family level or a community level, because there is a space that we need to have a voice for pain, right? Mm-hmm. But we have to be very discerning in how we do that. So for example, social media, I see all the time people voicing their pain and their emotional discomfort all over social media. Not the place for it. Not only do they not get help there, but they also usually end up getting more dislocation, to be honest with you, because, you know, not to pick on Twitter, but I will for a second. Twitter, for example, because of its instantaneous, you know, response, tends to work like a machine gun on people, where it's just constant bullets being thrown at them if they say something undesirable or something that doesn't resonate with people, or maybe it does resonate with people, they just don't like to hear it, you know. But it's very detrimental because we have actual cases where people have become suicidal because of social media, right? That's not the place to be doing it. But we can discern as a community where the right place for that is, right? And to create an atmosphere of safety. When we had the conference, one of the things that was reported at the conference was that people felt safe in a way they have not felt safe before to discuss these issues. It just takes a little bit of intentional thinking about how to go about that. Well, we can create those spaces, but we have to be responsible about them as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think your point about community is a really good point, right? And very needed, because if we look at community in general from a national to a local level, right? We have much more ability to impact things on a local level. So the more we invest, whether it's even more local and just our particular masjid, right? Or our family. We have, and the further we get out, the less impact we actually have, right? So at a national level, we really don't have the ability to affect that as much as we think we do, typically. But on a local level, we can really impact things. And that's where impact, like, I feel like they got what's the word I'm looking for? You know, like, shortchanged, yeah. Because what most people don't know is that impact in LA, they were able to get law enforcement off the table when it came to CVE. Law enforcement out of the picture, out of the equation. They're the only city in the United States that did that. And that was because of impact and the relationship building and rapport that they had developed with the city.
So their impact locally was nationally,
Yeah, I don't know about national,
Yeah,
right?
that's
I mean, I don't
yeah.
live national,
Yeah.
but I know locally they had a tremendous impact. But you
How
know,
many people know it in the community?
no,
That's the key.
and part of that is why we don't, you know, sometimes our activists are, I believe, I want to give them that they intend good, but the result of some of their actions is misguided, right? Because I think often to myself, I would not want to go into battle with many of these people. Because if you're going to give your strategy away to the world, you have no strategy, right? And if you have to tell...
Not to the world, but at least to the communities.
To the community, but
Islamic
what I
Center,
mean
like
is that...
Dr. Khaled said, when there is a lecture, this could be mentioned, could be something very positive to think
Yeah.
of. But also, when I talk about community, and correct me if I'm wrong, I personally have no sense of community at all. And I've been at the center for 30 years. I'm one of the first teachers at New Horizon, very, very first teachers. My students are doctors and engineers now and everything. But where is this sense of community? And I think our problem really lies here, number one. The center is not fun to be at. The center is a dogmatic area to be at. The center, you have to pretend, like you said in your speech a little bit earlier, so many things, you know, but there's no fun. Why would I go there?
You know, this goes back to your point is that, you know, it's like Islamic centers, having them be a space that is an honest reflection of our concerns and worries and fears, rather than a performance in religiosity, you know, where you go in and you put your taqwa hat on.
You listen and...
Assalamu alaikum, brother, how are you? And so on, and it's not
You do
it's
the
not
prayer
And
and
our young people reflect this, right? So I can go into the masjid and I have to perform a certain way, and then when I leave the masjid, I go to Starbucks or wherever else to meet up with my friends, and then we have like a real social interaction. Because what is in the masjid, for the majority of them, is false, right? And I would guess that the reason you don't feel community is you don't feel safe there.
No, I don't feel unsafe at all.
No, when I
It's
say
not really-
safe, I mean safe to be yourself.
I am myself, but I get in trouble if I'm myself.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'm rejected often. A lot of people that respect me a lot, I was never invited in their homes. I don't know them personally. So it stays at what? Sunday, I go and I listen to a lecture and I leave. I'm not interested personally. I prefer to listen to a videotape of him or somebody that I like to listen to. Then, you know.
Yeah, it's going to take a real change. I mean, one of the suggestions that we've given the masjid, I don't want to pick on ICSC because I want to applaud them for allowing us to even
Yeah,
come
of
in and
course,
do
and I'm
this.
not
I just
picking
want to
on
say that
anyone.
because what I'm going to say is kind of critical. One of the things that we have proposed, right, is so we had a wellness day, right? We did guided meditation during that wellness day. It was so well received. People want to have it, right?
I was at Centers, yeah.
And so people want to have it on a regular basis. We've got some resistance with that, but it looks like that may actually get off the ground. Constituents of the masjid have asked for AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and NA, Narcotics Anonymous, right? We can offer that. We have the facility to offer it.
Of course, but
But
also,
it was met with resistance. Wait a minute, what does that say about us as Muslims if we have this in the masjid, right? Well, it says that we are human beings who have issues that are part of modernity and we need to address them.
and
And that we're
alcohol
being
is addressed in the
responsible if we
Quran.
do address them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the comments I had, well, if we have AA, that it's as if we're saying we tacitly endorse the consumption of alcohol, which is completely.
It's BS. I mean, AA is not only alcohol. It could be about weight. It could be about so many things.
Right.
But also, I mean, those are great points, of course. But I'm not talking only about wellness, about depression, about misery, about poverty, about mental health, about good things too. I mean, to be, like Elena gave a speech the other day about the women that have conquered, the hijab and arrived to certain things. And she mentioned one of them was a producer of the movie. Why not show the movie at the center and support the producer instead of all the time listening to negative things? And I think brotherhood is an excellent idea. I mean, no black, no white, no yellow, no red will feel different if everybody is there with the spirit of Islam. I mean, just the fact that these events would take place at the Islamic Center would be at the spirit of the Islam. Because Islam is not only boredom and, negative things like that.
Let's go on to Anthony's question. Sorry, because we have a lot of questions
I
still.
actually don't
So.
want to answer Anthony's question.
Okay. That's okay.
What was the
No,
let me-
the question
let me
is
go
about
on.
liberalism.
Liberalism, yeah.
No, you don't have to answer it.
No, it's just a long question. Anthony, you
tough
asked
question.
really hard questions.
Sorry.
No, it's just, you're so smart, mashallah.
I can add a few more, and you can mix them in.
But at least, I mean, haram, the question about liberalism has
Okay,
been.
because
Okay.
he's
He's black.
That's
That's
if
what
we
to answer
answer
because he's black.
No, it's
I'm joking. I'm joking. I'm putting it.
No, I mean, I asked it because like, you deal in systems, and one of the things I understand about liberalism is kind of like it can be said that could be one of the reasons, at least ideologically, why we're seeing some disintegration at an ideological level. I mean, there's obviously like physical factors,
I do
prison
think,
industrial complex.
yes, I do think that has had an effect, and especially on our community, Muslim community, because we are collectivistic by nature, right?
Yeah, it's like a communitarian.
And when you push, what I call, you've heard me say this before, but individualism on crack, right? It's not healthy for the community. If we all just do whatever we want with the idea that we're not going to harm one another, I mean, how does that even happen? If we all indulge our very desires and whatever, eventually we're going to harm each other, and very much so.
I want to throw something in. I mean, we should have a whole halaqah on this, but there's so many social theorists that have talked about, I mean, not just empirically documented, but even theoretically developed. I mean, Charles Taylor's most recent book about the results of liberal individualist ideology and its product in terms of social alienation and uprootedness and rootlessness and then some, like Robert Unger, who basically respond in a take off Nietzsche's philosophy of, well, the way we overcome this is to create a secular religion of the superhuman, where you as an individual, we get you to believe in yourself as a god, and somehow, as you said, as if each individual as a god somehow will end up performing fairness towards each other, which actually doesn't work, because if we're all gods, we all log heads and produce maximum damage to each other. But the thing that troubles me is that you would think that Muslims would engage these discourses and make significant interventions, because that's the role of a religiously inspired ideology and a philosophical paradigm. But they don't. I mean, and we're. I don't know if I'll get in trouble by mentioning names. There was recently at Princeton a conversation between a famous Catholic natural law philosopher. Before that, there was a conversation about liberal philosophy and rootedness at Yale. And I was immediately struck that at the Princeton conversation, there was a very famous academic that was invited to be in conversation with an activist Muslim without any academic credentials. And at Yale, the same thing. There was a very famous, distinguished professor with a long record of publication to be in conversation with an activist Muslim without any academic credentials. And of course, when what you end up taking from this conversation is that Islam has nothing to offer. Because you have the academics saying very, very, very intelligent things, and the activists giving dogma. That's another conversation. Because I think the bad is on us. I mean, we have to force our way in. We have to, and as a Muslim community, we have to say, wait a minute, we're not attending this event if you're going to represent us through people that are not properly qualified. But okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I have a few questions that I'm going to put together. So, immigrant Muslims were taught halal and haram, allowed and prohibited. Real life is seldom black and white. Do you find that Muslims develop split personality disorder more than usual? Two.
Somebody's been watching that movie Split.
Two, why don't we encourage premarital and post-marriage counseling so that the couple can raise and educate their kids in a healthy way, or their lives in a healthy way? Three. What are some specific examples of how your practice as a Muslim therapist differs from the work of non-Muslim therapists working with predominantly non-Muslim clients? Do you utilize alternative strategies in dealing with issues like addiction, gender nonconformity, etc., or is this generally standardized across the field? And lastly, as a Muslim mother and also a therapist who has seen the troubles plaguing our children and youth, what are some of the things you would advise parents on with regard to child rearing?
I have like whole books in about okay, what was the first question,
Okay, so the first one is about the incidence of split personality disorder.
So interestingly, all babies, at least this is a theory, right? That all babies, we split when we're babies, right? Because assuming that the child is taking the breast, right? Mom has to go away to use the bathroom at some point and to do other things. So when mom goes away and the baby is discomforted, then what happens, right? We can't make mom bad, right? So we split to say that we have a good breast and a bad breast, or that we have a good mom and a bad mom. So this is a natural sort of inclination at infancy. It's a coping mechanism. So the fact that we split in other ways because of things that happen in society, in and of itself, it's not a bad thing if it's coping in such a way that if it's a coping mechanism that actually helps us deal with life, right? If it turns into a detour where we become I'm Mr. Imam at the masjid and then I'm Mr. Player outside, then that's a problem, right? Because that's dysfunctional and it's not leading us in the direction of anything really meaningful in our lives. So does that happen in our community? To the extent that we do not promote healthy interaction, that to the extent that we don't allow space for people to grow in a healthy way, sure it happens, right? Does it happen more frequently than, say, non-Muslim communities? I'm not really sure that that's the case. Because even for as liberal as some people are who are not religious, they still have children that hide from them. They still have children that rebel. As quiet as it's kept, every child is going to have a major or a minor rebellion. It's just how major or minor is it, you know? I like to remind parents that you are actually not getting through any child without some kind of rebellion. And be grateful if the rebellion is not too bad. If you look at your own lives, all of us as adults, we all rebelled in some way against, what our parents. And it's usually, just to let you know, usually often is somehow correlated with that which you love the most. So if you love your religion the most, your child might be a little bit rebellious toward religion. If you love, whatever it is you're invested in, your child may rebel against that. Not always, but it's a decent indicator. What were some of the other questions? So we should actually encourage more premarital and postmarital counseling. I encourage it every opportunity I get. Even if somebody did not go through premarital counseling, even after they're married, it's still good to go through something like a premarital counseling. We have we've actually canned this into now about 10 to 12 sessions, looking at the we know from researchers basically 4 areas that lead to divorce. Those have to do with sex between a couple, in-laws, children, and finances. And so if we can get at least good communication started around those 4 issues, then you have a better chance for a successful outcome than not. And part of that is learning communication, right? It's also learning about what was the style of the family which you came from and the family that you're entering into, right? Because we all like to believe that we put the milk in the same place in the refrigerator in every family, but we don't. And so, it's good to know that ahead of time if you can, so that you can work through what's really meaningful and what's not. So you can negotiate, learn how to negotiate with one another. Oftentimes, when somebody marries outside of their culture, it's a lot easier because there's already a given that you expect not to have the same values in that way. But those are good things to know. What are the dynamics between mom and dad in the family of origin? Were they affectionate toward each other? Did they never touch each other? Because that's a good predictor of the person you're marrying, what they will be like, right? Also, what was their relationship like with their closest sibling, right, in age to them? Did they have a confrontational relationship? Were they friends? That will also tell you something about the person you're marrying, right? So we have a lot that we've learned from research and studying the human being that we can impart to people when they're going through this process to make it better, to have a better, rate of success of marriage. I'm not scared of divorce in our community either, because that was something that happened in the early communities of Muslims. And as we are a very diverse community and we're trying to get this together, it happens. It's going to happen. How we go about that, it would be nice if we could do it in a much, more amicable way. If we could even do more work around blended families. If that's a reality in our community, can we do more, not just premarital counseling, but for like two people, but for blended families?
Heather, I get a lot of, but maybe it's just me, but I get a lot of correspondence from Muslim women who want to marry non-Muslim men.
Yeah,
Um,
I see that come up a lot too.
and what do you, I mean, usually the question is, you know, can you either help me get my family to accept, or can you perform the ceremony, which I don't, but that's something else. Or what do you think is gonna happen? And so what do you tell them?
So this is a really tough one for me to answer because, well, mainly because it's not just you and I talking, right? We're talking to a group of people now, and in order for me to hold the frame of accepting my client that's before me, I can't really exactly tell you what I think about that. What I can tell you is that that's what I do, is I accept what's before me, and I try to help that person move to the best place for them. Now, there is a real reality out there that there is a lack of men stepping up to get married, right? If they can get everything they want in life without getting married, they're doing that. So there are a lot of women. I mean, our women are held to a different standard than the men. I have not a few times, but many times, heard women talk about, if I want to marry a virgin man, it's almost impossible to find, right? Increasingly, it's becoming the same for women. But, I mean, for a man to find a woman who's a virgin, right? And we do see some flipping of gender roles happening. But why shouldn't they both be entitled to the same thing, right? I mean, this is a really complex issue, and my heart really breaks for both sides of the issue, both of our young people, right? I mean, both genders, because we don't have any really good systems built right now for marriage to find people, to help people find people. It is not like it was before, where even in America, when I was growing up, like my grandparents used to have my aunts and uncles come to their house every weekend, and we knew all our neighbors, and you know, you knew families, so that you could suggest for a person, this might be a good person for you, you know, and that is a lot of our traditional societies as well, but we have not developed that in our own communities here, and you know, even if I know somebody, I may not know to recommend them for marriage, right? I mean, there are just not a lot of good systems in place, so this becomes a real issue. Because even if the guy converts to marry the woman, right, which we see happen, my question then is, are they going to have a strong foundational base for the children? Because if the man is not leading the household, which I'm traditional, so I'm just going to put that out there. I know some people have feelings about that. Then what are the children going to get, right? Now, mom can carry that, that education, that tarbiyah, right? But I don't know. I mean, you know, that's something to consider. Because marriage in itself, many of the issues can be worked out between two individuals, but once children enter the picture, that's a whole other world. You know. Yeah. I don't know if I answered that question.
No, it's best as you can under the circumstances.
Let's take a question.
The last question about the child development or parenting, right? So another suggestion that we've made to ICSE particularly is to have child development classes every quarter. They're good for parents, they're good for people who are thinking about getting married, they're good for grandparents. To learn about the different life stages and the development in those life stages is extremely important for everybody. So I've proposed that we offer this every quarter at the masjid so that our parents, our community can learn, because it's not just the board that needs to be involved at the masjid, all the people there need to play a part. And I see, like they have parent circle at the masjid, right? And they're right now currently talking about Sister Munira and Noha's book on positive parenting. And I see even people within that group who I think would take a much more active role if they were given, you know, the ability to do so. If they were called upon and said, hey, we need you to do this, right? I think they would do it. We have to invest in our community. One of the things that we don't even know right now, right, is what our community has to offer. What are the skill sets of the members of our community?
We don't make good use of our resources, that's for sure.
You know, many people assume I'm Arab,
Right,
so
yeah, a lot of people thought you were Palestinian, Syrian,
Halabi,
yeah, Syrian.
and I don't mind that, right? But I even had a professor once at the end of the semester say to me, "You're black, aren't you?" Because of what I checked off for her as markers of that culture, right? She is black herself, you know. I've been thought of as being South Asian. I mean, you know, people have a particular narrative and a way of seeing you, how it makes them feel, right? But I'm just saying that at the end of the day, I'm trying to acknowledge more of my privilege, to do something good with it, but it's not been something in the forefront of my mind.
Okay, I have a couple more questions. I think we have a couple other people who haven't asked yet. So these two are related. Do HIPAA laws protect the privacy of Muslims going down the path of radicalization, or would this constitute reportable, quote-unquote, potential harm to others? And if the latter, what safe spaces are available for these Muslims to work through those types of issues, radicalization?
So the thing about radicalization, it's a term, but honestly, alhamdulillah, we actually don't have enough profiles to make a profile of what a terrorist is. And so alhamdulillah for that, because I don't think we ever want to reach the point where we can actually say this is the profile of a terrorist. What we do have are some indications, which I talk about in that report, of what a path toward radicalization looks like: cognitive closures, alienation, isolation, different things, right? We also know, for example, like with Orlando, with the New York guy who took his truck and ran into a bunch of people, right? Both cases, the person had issues with their sexuality, right? What were some of the other cases? We had the case in, was it Tennessee, or it was one of the states in that area, where the young man ran his car into some people, right? He was he had PTSD or something, I can't remember. There are different issues, right, going on with these people, that we can actually recognize that there are mental health issues going on. Where we don't see actually, you know, an account for that, and when it's not a Muslim, right? We don't actually see that being accounted for. But that is just to say, there is actually no one profile for what that looks like. Now, can I help them if they're showing some of the symptoms that lead that direction? Absolutely. Do I report that? Heck no. I mean, it falls under their privacy. Now, if I thought it was reaching the level where it would hurt people, other people, like it was that they're threatening harm to self or others, then yes, I report that. And that's how privacy works, for better or worse. There are protected statuses in privacy. So let's say somebody comes in, this is one of the ethics questions we get in law and ethics. if somebody comes in, they have HIV, let's say, right? And they say, I'm going to take my HIV and infect as many people as I want, you know? HIV is a protected status. We cannot share that with anyone. So even though that's threatening harm to others theoretically, we can't share that. So there are even limits to that. And when somebody, I feel, is getting to the point where they may be broaching a breach of privacy, I remind them of those limits. I'll say, you're very close, I just want to remind you of your privacy, and these are the limits of it. So that they know if they pass that line, I will have to act. And I've had to act before, particularly around children, and violence toward children. Not the most comfortable thing to do, and with time, you know, each therapist makes their own decision about that. But for me personally, because I've been through it both ways, I will tell the family, this is what's going to happen, because I don't believe in secretly doing it. I think it's even more harming, because the ultimate end is that we want health, we want reunification. So I'm very open and straightforward about that. But yeah, I mean, to the extent that we can, we protect everybody. We had, you know, since we have this forum to say so, I'm going to say it, you know, in the last year, in 2017, between Orange County and LA County, we had close to 50 suicides in our community, in the Muslim community. That's
Between
something
when and
to
when, I'm
discuss.
sorry? Between
Orange County and LA County.
Just the last year.
How many
Just
people,
last year,
do you think that the community of Muslims, whether here or across the world, are too much restricting their children in a narrow way, that they're not coming out thinking about issues that are pertinent to the Muslims as communities? They're not producing scientists, they're not producing socialists. They're not producing anybody or any. They're like Dr. Abou El Fadl says, rejuvenating. We are not opening up our children to accept things, and we keep narrowing their stream of thinking until we kill them, until the Muslim communities across the world are not moving forth. I mean, is that religious? Is it coming from the religion itself, or is it cultural? I mean,
Perhaps, I don't think it's coming from the religion. Maybe I would modify that to say perhaps an understanding of the religion, right? A culture and an understanding of the religion, not the religion itself. I am one of those people who advocates constantly for the most acceptable, allowable tolerance of boundaries in Islam, right? I had a discussion recently with a scholar who, it was around sexuality, and most, I don't know, okay, I'm just going to, because one of my specialties is sex therapy, so I'm sorry if it's too uncomfortable for people, but I'm going to talk about it.
This is where we
So,
talk about everything.
You
It's
know,
quite embarrassing.
it was around the permissibility of anal sex, okay? And there are, in most of the madhabs, it's haram, right? But it's supposedly in the Maliki madhab, it's makruh. People debate, now they're debating, are these weak hadith? Is it really makruh? I don't know. But my point was to the scholar, why eliminate it? What if that act in and of itself was the difference between a couple getting divorced or staying married? I mean, maybe that's what turns that particular couple on. Who am I to tell them what should and shouldn't, if it's in the bounds of what is acceptable? And, you know, that's one of the edge examples, and the reason why I give it is because that is what I'm talking about. Those tolerance and those boundaries should be as far and wide and acceptable as we can make them to accommodate all that is within our community.
Between Orange County and LA, so many suicides in 1 year. Do you have a sense of why so many? I mean, And what could have been done to save some of these lives?
And how does that compare to previous years? Is that increasing?
I don't know.
Fundamental cause of that.
How about national?
So LA County itself has one of the highest suicide rates for teenagers in the country. Because I'm sure for a number of reasons, that's a really complex thing as well. Because I'll give it one reason LA has that kind of high suicide rate is because we have one of the highest populations of LGBT in the country, right? And LGBT kids tend to be very suicidal. Because of the lack of acceptance, because of the lack of, but a lot of them travel across the country to come to LA because we have the most resources for that group than anywhere else, I think.
What's LGBT?
I'm sorry, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender.
Okay.
But also minority groups of teenagers tend to also be vulnerable groups when it comes to suicide, right? So we see higher rates and we're looking at different age spans now within a 2 or 3 year range, right? But certain places we see a higher rate with the Latinos. Certain place, more females more females attempt suicide. More males actually complete. What else can I tell you? I mean, suicide itself tends to be contagious amongst teenagers. So when one teenager sees it as an what I mean by that is that when one sees it as an option, then their friends tend to see it as an option as well. And why we see it happen, so we don't talk about it. Out of those numbers I gave you, very few of those families actually admitted that that's what happened. It's very few people that do the mortuary work that actually know that that's what it was. Because there's such shame involved in it, and then the issue of can that person, right, and which is far beyond my knowledge. But we don't, by not talking about it, we're doing a disservice because the kids talk about it. We did a suicide prevention lecture at New Horizons Pasadena, and we did one with the parent. We did it twice there actually, but we did 2 sessions with the parents, and we did one with the teenagers. Now, when I asked the teenagers there's a very popular series on Netflix called 13 Reasons Why. Yes. All of the kids had watched it. Very few of the parents had watched it because they didn't even know about it. And all the kids had watched it. It was about 13 reasons why the girl decided to kill herself. And it was inspired by a very popular singer amongst teenagers. She was inspired to do this series because of her own struggles with and mental health challenges, right? I watched it because after I hear in therapy sessions of a media, whatever is a film or show or whatever 3 times, I watch it because that's my sort of line. And when I watched that show, I'm a therapist. I'm trained in trauma therapy. I'm trained in sex therapy. I was traumatized watching that thing because it shows traumas in such graphic depiction that we have something called vicarious trauma. And this is one of the other aspects of social media that's so damaging. Vicarious trauma is when a person can be traumatized without having to actually experience the trauma themselves. So when we show and banter about pictures of people being killed all over the world in gruesome ways, we can get some of that vicarious trauma, right? It's not helpful to us. As human beings, I don't think we're built to honestly take in all of that's coming at us. And if we are not mindful about how we preserve our time and spend it and so forth, that's where we do have some accountability and responsibility for our mental health, right? Like you said, the person who sits and watches soaps and things like that. That was you, wasn't it?
Wait, this point about trauma is so because I noticed this among all teens, there's sort of a sense of, it was even with me though, like the sense of, oh, nothing affects me, I should be able to watch anything, and what's available on the net is, some of it is incredibly graphic. I mean, everything is accessible. I was talking to this someone had heard about just the entire trauma of the world is just a few buttons away, and the deep injury it must do to the psychology of people, especially if that they have that culture of, if it's on the net, then it's fair game.
Right. No, absolutely. It's priming, right? It's priming people for something more, for kids. It's like what predators do. First they prime children before they can actually do anything to them, to see, will you accept this? It's like a little shaitan, you know? And on a systemic level, at the national level, like we've seen this happen too with shows and media and stuff, right? So in the 70s, you never would have seen somebody sitting on a toilet in a show. They wouldn't show you going to the bathroom. Now they show everything. You don't even have to see a rated R movie to see sex because it's on TV on a regular basis. Not just what we would consider, sort of regular sex, right? It's every kind of sex.
From a psychological perspective, one of the things that I see it as when I first heard about it, I didn't even believe it, and then I realized that it's an increasing phenomenon. There's in a lot of the disturbing sites, and whether we're talking about just straightforward pornography, or we're talking about sites that show even there was a site that showed like a rape of a woman in Iraq. Eventually the people who raped her were actually caught and executed, but the actual rape was there on the net. But there's increasing trend of a lot of sites in the same way that they have, Black, Asian, fetishes.
Yeah.
They have Muslim.
Or Arab.
And a lot of the Muslim category is collecting. Social theorists have said a lot about the relationship between colonialism and fetishes and the construction of pornographic imagination towards the dominated Muslim and so on. But from a psychological point of view, why the explosion of these sites with the rise of Islamophobia? What impact does this material have on our children who can access these sites very easily? I've had a conversation from a law enforcement perspective about when law enforcement encounters Muslims, and that's a very troubling topic, a very, very disturbing topic. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't know, this phenomenon is not really new because the
You
same
mean
thing
since
happened.
Orientalism?
Well, I was thinking in the Black experience because a lot of times you'll find that like Black people historically have been systematically hypersexualized by the dominant culture, while at the same time being dominated by by the dominant culture. So I kind of wonder, is that do you think that there's like a similar? Yeah, is it definitely like a similar kind of trend? Same thing
As
with.
I understand, a lot of them like they'll have a woman wearing the hijab, but
Yeah.
naked otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's a fetish about the hijab, I guess.
I think there are a lot of things influencing that. I mean, first we saw in the Gulf countries, right, like prostitutes would wear hijab and ibaya and nothing underneath, right? That was the mark of the, or lingerie underneath. That's the prostitute. So depending on where you are in the world, it's a different reason. But like, I think here, this was one of the things that troubled me about, and I heard the sister and her reason and everything, and you know, it's not about the sister who did the piece, right? But this was one of the reasons I was bothered by, as a psychologist or from a psychological perspective, bothered by the piece that was in Playboy, right? Written by the hijabi.
Right.
Because that's exactly where I believe we were going, to fetishizing hijab. And that was my fear, that that's what would happen. Now I think for her it was to, I think she thought something about dollars. I can't remember. I think she had a good intention, maybe.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't
honestly
know her personally.
I want
know the
to
piece you're
believe
talking
she had
about.
a good intention, right? So it's not about her personally, but this is where we have to have bounds. We have to have boundaries and limits, right? Because what does promoting something in pornography do? It's not going to produce something positive for us. And it has a long-term effect, right? Pornography itself has a long-term effect, both in our system in general. So what tends to happen is that, and we saw this happen actually in France, right? In France, at some point, they started taking down billboards of naked or mostly naked women because men were not able to have sex with their wives by the time they got home. They were so stimulated all day long that it was affecting the marital life. We're going to see the same thing happen here.
Like social media.
Yeah.
Like social media and
Yes.
the reason of divorce.
Yeah, well, yes, and then also another phenomenon I've seen is that because of the access to these things, our children who save themselves for marriage have ideas about what it should be like and end up harming each other. Like physically harming each other because they have an expectation that's not based in reality of what sexual life is like. Because all of that is fantasy. A lot of those videos are about acting out fantasies. It has a profound effect on our community.
Sci-fi. Sci-fi.
Sci-fi?
So
I'm not
Fiction.
sure it's sci-fi,
Fiction.
but it's
It's amazing. All the movies are
So
fiction.
Heather, this has been so amazing. I just want to respect your time because it's already 6:20. We would love to have you as long as you're willing to stay.
I just want to make this one last
So-
comment about the sex part. Which is that on the other side of it, right, we have about 56% of women who are married in long-term marriages report dissatisfaction in their sex life. And that they, even if they feel pain, discomfort, anything like that, they'll continue to have sex because they believe it's their duty. But these things are not talked about. How unhealthy is that, right? It doesn't have to be that way. In fact, most of those women could be easily, brought to a much better place because it tends to be like things like hormones or, things that can be adjusted if they just talk about it. But they've been taught or conditioned to believe that it's not important for them, and this flies in the face of what we believe as Muslims. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the basis of divorce is a woman's satisfaction, right?
Yeah, among women.
So.
What?
Or this.
Can you just talk about your work at USC and your center and what you are looking to accomplish and what you maybe just some
You
like
had a question?
I just wanted to ask, like when you were talking about as Muslims, we don't have a system in place to address all these issues.
Yeah.
And that's why I kind of asked, don't you think it's, I don't want to say responsibility or obligation, but for scholars, teachers, psychologists, professionals to encourage counseling on an earlier level, which is not happening. I mean, I know we need it. There's a need for, you said, you encourage it. But there's no platform that is discussed on any forum, masjids or whatnot. So
That was what was so great about what we were doing at New Horizons, because if you can teach children at a young age about the benefits of mental health, as opposed to waiting for mental illness to occur, like mental health, you plant the seeds for an option for later in life when they actually need a therapist. I mean, some children need them as well, but most children don't, right? And so that seed is planted, though, that later on, if I have trouble, this is where I can go to get help. And so it really starts, the thing I liked about what we were trying to develop at New Horizons was that it was a all-inclusive program where the administrators, the teachers, the bus driver, everybody's involved in that.
And the
Not
parents.
just, and the parents, not just the kids themselves, right?
It's a key, it's
Um,
a key.
at least there's communication now when these issues that we all talked about, can be addressed,
Right.
which is really lacking. Because it's taboo to talk about all these things,
Who said, though, that it was taboo? That's what I want to know.
It's sad, but I mean,
Culture.
it shouldn't be.
Traditions and
Culture,
yeah.
But
plays,
not
and
our Muslim
gen-
tradition.
The culture.
So,
I think people
is it
give,
colonization? I don't know, like where,
70 to 80%.
I mean, clearly, there's a lot written about the closing of Muslim culture, because I mean, we've gone from an increasing openness to an increasing narrowness, and it took partly the Crusades, it took partly the Mongol invasion. I mean, the mass rapes that occurred during the Crusades and the mass rapes that occurred during we're talking about millions of women raped. The production, the reaction to that is closing in culture, and then the brief period of openness that preceded colonialism and the mass rapes committed by British, French, and Dutch forces all over the Muslim world. Even Muslims' historical narratives concealed it. I mean, they would allude to it, they would reference it, but they don't want. And I know that in Egypt, we culturally, we see certain eye color or color of the hair, and we know that this is either the descendants of Greek immigrants or the descendants of families that were raped by the Crusades in the invasion of Fayoum, and there's a whole cultural narrative to it. So, but the problem is, I mean, one of the most remarkable insights that you've lended today is that this idea of generational scarring and generational trauma, because you're absolutely right. I mean, this is where psychology actually weaves in a very powerful way with history, and with the craft of a historian that can investigate the origins of trauma in generations. But if Islam should empower us with anything, it's the impetus to heal.
right, if we actually know our Islam, it's an opening.
Precisely.
And it's not just us, by the way. Like, I am always dumbfounded, right, when I talk to South Asian people, and this is a culture that produced the Kama Sutra, right, as a spiritual document. That wasn't like some shady, thing.
It wasn't
It was a
pornography.
spiritual document, and yet it's one of the most sexually repressive societies I've seen. Why? Doesn't make any sense.
I not too many Muslims today even read like 1001 Nights. If you read 1001 Nights, it's graphically sexual.
That's true.
And yet,
Beautiful.
it's a reflection of the extent to which we've gone back. I mean, while we can understand the historical process, it's not enough. And historian can't heal. Historian can simply just identify, track the narrative. But I mean, I'm gonna let Grace close, but I just want to say that I consider you a pioneer by all measures. You're just in my I'm not a person that is easily impressed, but you're a pioneer, and I think one of the biggest functions that one of the biggest inspirational roles that you play is to inspire other Muslims to follow in your footsteps and to take psychology seriously and mental health seriously. And every time we meet, and it's been like that for years. Every time we meet, my intellect gets so excited about all the things that I can investigate, and everyone knows that my intellect doesn't get easily excited. I usually have to go read heavy Kant or Nietzsche or some heavy duty philosopher to get it. So it's a huge compliment to you that I get so excited.
Well, if you're interested, I really want to write a cross-disciplinary book around sexuality in Islam, right? From the psychological perspective and the legal perspective, so that people have something they can refer to in their own privacy to say, I'm okay, right? Because I don't think we have anything like that. Maybe the 1001, but I don't know.
No, we have manuals like Rawdat al-Muhibbin by Ibn Qayyim. We have these sexual manuals that were written by fuqaha, but they're one, they shock the modern Muslims. I mean, I in my younger years, I got kicked out of so many Islamic centers for recommending that the Imam read these manuals before the council married people. They talk about everything, climax, orgasm, oral sex, sexual positioning, but they're written in the style of medieval sexual treatises. And the remarkable thing is that they're written by fuqaha, and they're written as part of fulfilling or advising people on how to do right by your wife and how to do right by your husband and how to satisfy them so that you don't run afoul of God's law.
Yeah.
I think a couple of them have been translated. Most of them have not been translated. But I think if you're gonna write this, it would be really fascinating if you read a few of them as you undertake the process. Because, for instance, the example of anal sex, I know that growing up, one of the big schismatics between Sunnis and Shias is that you talk a lot of the Sunnis who want to demonize the Shia. They say, oh, okay, they allow anal sex. Can you believe how disgusting these people are? But then as you study law and you discover that a lot of Sunni jurists talked about anal sex and eroticism, and in fact there is a famous even Hanafi faqih who is asked, this is in the 9th century Hijrah, it says that basically his wife demands sexual sex, she can only orgasm through anal sex. And the Hanafi faqih, his fatwa is, then you must provide her with anal sex. It is an obligation upon you. Now, this material, what I find is that when I've stopped even talking about these topics because of all the times I've been kicked out of Islamic centers and what do you call it, summer camps, Muslim summer camps, when you're asked a question and then you give a response by, such and such faqih and this day and this fatwa said, and they kick you out. But
I'm not sure what we're afraid of either. It's not going to catch on like wildfire because
it's not like
in truth, it's not even a comfortable thing for most men, right? I mean, there are anatomical things that it actually doesn't work for most men. That's a whole nother like educational piece that we can have, right? Because because there are real reasons for
And
that.
we can overcome the Shia Sunnah thing, which I think is very troubling.
Yeah, well, why do we have to have that here?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not an issue here, right?
Right.
I think. I don't know.
Shouldn't be.
The more we talk about it, it becomes an issue.
But this is actually, just to go back to what Grace asked me to do, this is actually one of the projects of the center, is to translate text that have to do with psychology from Arabic to English. And so we see that as a cross-disciplinary project. We need people from, Near East Studies, religious studies, to work with us to do that, to make sure we have proper context and that we have, the fiqh, the luga, fiqh luga or luga fiqh. And but we have about 10 to 12 projects that we're trying to bring to scale all at the same time, right? So it's a very ambitious plan, but they fit into 3 categories. One is research, where we are furthering the Genogram research that I started, also the research on Islamophobia. The second is direct services, so an actual clinic. The clinic at USC itself has taken a little bit more time to get up and going, but as of this fall, I'm supposed to be a faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry. So we will have, the clinic within that department. And then the third piece is community outreach. And so one of the projects there is the empowering the masajid. But we have others as well, such as looking at technology and how we can use that to do therapy. So telehealth, texting. We actually know of when children or college students, there are a handful of words, if they text them, we know that they are edging towards suicide. And one of those words is aspirin. So there are words that we wouldn't normally, just assume, but because aspirin is easy for children to get and they try to overdose on aspirin. And so, there are a lot of things that we're looking at that are innovative, hopefully not considered bid'ah, but they're innovative. And
Good.
So we're trying to get a lot of people involved. It's not a one-person show by any means, and we need as many people as we can get to be involved. We of course need funding, but we did get actually some. Salam actually donated some property in Maryland to create a second clinic in Rockville, Maryland. And so we are hoping to get that up and running by May. But we also have, May is the Mental Health Awareness Month in the United States, so we will be launching as well a referral line. It's not a hotline, but it's a referral line, so it's called Muslim Mental Health Referral Line, and anyone can call in, and then within SoCal, get a referral to either a therapist or a social worker or a neurologist, any of the ancillary professions, psychiatrist, whatever they need, that we've been able to identify, and we're continuing to collect information, but we have tried the best we can to collect as many people within our community that we can, because that's part of it. People don't know where they can go and they can trust the services, right? So I got a grant from a foundation here on the west side, Robert L. Simon Foundation. They gave me a grant to create the referral line, so that will launch in May. I don't know. I can send you. There's so many projects going on. We have our conference that we will continue to have annually, inshallah.
The hotline is for everybody, not for the Muslim community.
What, I'm sorry?
The hotline
The
you're talking
hotline,
about?
anybody can call it,
Is
but
for
it's actually for Muslim practitioners.
And you got the grant from non-Muslim?
A Jewish foundation.
Fantastic. That's what you were talking about. Fantastic.
Unfortunately,
Doesn't matter.
unfortunately, it wasn't within our community, but fortunately,
Beginning is-
you know what? These people were so, mashallah,
Understand.
amazing, because as an oppressed people themselves, understanding that also if something happens to us, their people could be the next target, because they know how close they are to the same thing happening to them. Felt a need to invest in our mental health and well-being, and this is what happened.
I dream of the days that, that Jews can apply to Muslim foundations for funding, and
I also will give them.
I just sit there and fantasize.
That's
I
a
mean,
beginning.
I still, you know, you go to certain areas and I get so irritated when I listen to, when I see how expensive the cars. I can smell Muslims, you know, wherever they are,
Smell what?
in which areas I can smell them. I can just realize. I know where Muslims dwell, and I'm just, I look at the cars and say, why do you need to drive a car that costs like $500,000? I mean, this money doesn't belong to you. I don't care how much money you make. This money doesn't belong to you. But, you know, anyway.
Well, this was the article on the news online, right? Because the King of Saudi Arabia rented out a whole hotel here in LA.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Oh, it's every year at the
God.
Beverly Hilton.
It was for his, in fact, it's today the 7th?
It's
He's
what?
leaving today. But he read, and so it was kind of a controversial article about why he needed to rent out the whole hotel.
The
how
whole
it's like
The whole hotel.
the whole
hotel.
hotel. It's like $600 a
But
night.
this happens
I
every year.
was one of the times I was hospitalized at UCLA. I learned that when often people, not just from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait or and all that, but they come, they'll rent from the hospital the entire floor so that they will be the only patient on the floor. And the UCLA does it because it gives them a lot of money,
Yeah.
I mean, for financial reasons. And they tip the nurses and.
You know, honestly, I was thinking, you know, one day, like Ivanka Trump went to Saudi Arabia, right? And or Ivanka, the daughter.
Ivanka.
Yeah.
The daughter.
And they gave her $100 and something million for her charity, right? And like 1 or 2 of those would have been enough for our center, right?
You know,
To be endowed, not to just have for a year, but to be endowed, right? Like we don't.
I had a friend manager at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and he said that every year they come, they take a wing for their wives and a wing for the prostitutes. And I've seen many of them in restaurants, you know, one man sitting with 4 blondes over him. I mean, I'm not kidding. My sister worked as an air hostess for a month at the Saudi Arabian line. And they told her, you know, you're going to see bottles of whiskey under the chairs, pretend you don't see them. When she went to get her first salary, the gentleman who's giving her the salary told her, don't you have a boyfriend? You're coming to ask for your salary? She quit after a month. But I mean, those are the Saudi Arabian. It's nothing new what they're doing.
I'm not even looking at the money that I gave up on golf money a long time ago. I'm even thinking of wealthy American Muslims
Yeah.
who hoard their
I've been
wealth.
advised not to even consider because of the geopolitical, the stuff that
Yeah.
I'm not really that interested in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because I want to do the work.
I'm not mentioning this for the money. It's not. It's beyond money.
Yeah.
I know.
It's way beyond money.
So Heather, thank
we
you.
have the wealth.
Thank you.
We do, as an American Muslims, we do.
Yeah.
No, Heather, this was so wonderful. I cannot tell you just what an honor and what a blessing to know about the work that you're doing. It's so impressive. I really hope that you'll join us again and we can continue this conversation because it's so clear that, you know, there's so much learning that needs to go on. And like one of the reasons why this institute exists is that we really feel it's important for us to look at the current context that we live in. And to your point about, you know, the understanding people were different at a different time, we have not done the sufficient work to understand what does it mean to, you know, come up with the right solutions for our time, our age, our context. And so these are such important, you know, insights for everyone to even be aware. I mean, there's obviously so much work that needs to happen, and and to get his brain excited is really a big deal. But so please do join us again. We would love to continue this conversation. And I don't know how long you can stay, but I just didn't want to
No,
keep
no,
you
thank you.
hostage. This is
I'm
fabulous.
actually supposed to try to make it to see my husband's.
Can you tell
I
us about
can.
you? Do you speak Arabic? Are you married to an Arab, or how did you
Oh, she
get
went to
to?
the famous Sherman Jackson.
Oh, I
Oh,
didn't see. I didn't know.
I only saw him speak once at.
Yeah, I don't. That's the first time I hear you or
No, it's
see you.
okay. Yeah, no, I speak Arabic. شوية بس. I studied Arabic in college, but it goes more or less depending on the company I keep. And once I get back into it, I'm okay. But it takes me a minute. You know, my friends from my college days they don't like my Arabic anymore because they said it's like half Khaliji and half Egyptian, and it's muddled basically.
Just follow the Egyptian.
I don't know what it is anymore. I just try to get by. But I could definitely improve it. I want to improve it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.